The salesman thought humiliating her would impress his wealthy clients, but he had no idea he was about to destroy his own career in less than 5 minutes. The glass walls of Bennett Luxury Motors shimmered beneath the late afternoon sun, reflecting rows of exotic cars polished so perfectly they looked untouched by human hands. Marble floors echoed with quiet footsteps, designer perfume lingered in the air, and soft jazz floated through the massive showroom where million-dollar deals were made with handshakes and smiles that rarely reached the eyes. Brandon Cole adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit as he watched a silver Aston Martin being rolled onto the display platform. At 38, Brandon had built his reputation on one simple belief. Rich people looked rich, and anyone who didn't look the part was a waste of time. Then the front door slid open. Claire Bennett stepped quietly into the showroom wearing faded blue jeans, clean white sneakers, and a cream cardigan that looked more comfortable than expensive. A canvas tote bag rested on her shoulder, and her light brown hair was tied back in a loose ponytail. She paused near the entrance for a moment, taking in the showroom with calm blue eyes, while several salesmen glanced toward her before quickly losing interest. Brandon noticed her immediately, not because she looked important, but because she looked completely out of place. He exchanged a smirk with another salesman near the espresso bar. "Watch this," he muttered under his breath before straightening his tie and approaching her with a polished smile that carried just enough condescension to sting. "Good afternoon," Brandon said smoothly. "Can I help you find the used inventory? That building's about 2 blocks east." Claire blinked softly, then offered a polite smile. "Actually, I wanted to ask about the Aston Martin." Brandon's expression froze for half a second. Behind him, another salesman nearly choked on his coffee. Claire pointed toward the silver coupe displayed beneath the spotlight. "That one," she added quietly. "I'd love to test drive it if possible." Brandon slowly looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her sneakers. Then came the smile, the kind designed to embarrass someone without raising his voice. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "that vehicle starts at $240,000. Claire nodded gently. "Yes, I saw that online." Brandon let out a soft laugh through his nose while 2 nearby clients turned subtly toward the conversation. "Of course you did," he replied. "Well, unfortunately, we only allow test drives for serious buyers." The room seemed to pause for a beat. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her tote bag, but her expression never changed. "I am serious," she answered calmly. Brandon tilted his head, amused now. "I'm sure you are." A few quiet chuckles came from the sales desk nearby. One receptionist lowered her eyes to hide a smile. Claire glanced once more at the Aston Martin, the silver paint glowing beneath the showroom lights. "My younger sister just finished her final round of cancer treatment last month," she said softly. "She's always dreamed of riding in one. I wanted to surprise her." For the briefest moment, silence touched the room. But Brandon only folded his arms tighter. "That's a lovely story," he said. "But this isn't a museum attraction. It's a luxury dealership." The marble floors echoed as another wealthy couple entered the showroom behind them, dressed in designer suits and expensive watches. Brandon's attention shifted instantly. His entire demeanor changed. "Now those," he thought quietly, "are real customers." Brandon's polished smile widened the moment the wealthy couple stepped onto the marble floor. It was almost theatrical how quickly he abandoned Claire without another glance. "Mr. and Mrs. Davenport," he said warmly as he moved toward them with both hands open. "Welcome back. The Bentley Continental you asked about just arrived this morning." Claire remained standing beside the silver Aston Martin, while the receptionist behind the desk pretended not to stare at her. Across the showroom, another salesman whispered something under his breath, and quiet laughter followed. Claire heard every bit of it. She simply chose not to react. That was the strange thing about people like Claire Bennett. Years earlier, comments like those would have embarrassed her. But after spending nearly a decade helping families at children's hospitals through the Bennett Foundation, she had learned something important. People revealed themselves most clearly when they thought someone had nothing to offer them. Brandon escorted the wealthy couple directly to the same Aston Martin Claire had asked about moments earlier. "Feel free to sit inside," he said smoothly as he opened the driver's side door with exaggerated care. "This particular model has a custom interior imported from Italy." Mrs. Davenport smiled approvingly while settling into the leather seat. Claire quietly watched from several feet away. Brandon noticed her reflection in the showroom glass and decided to push things further. Some people, he announced loudly enough for nearby customers to hear, come into places like this just to pretend for a few minutes. But luxury vehicles require serious financial commitment. The implication landed exactly how he intended. Several customers glanced toward Claire before quickly looking away again. A young receptionist shifted uncomfortably behind the desk. Claire slowly approached the vehicle once more. "I only asked for a test drive," she said softly. "I did not realize kindness required a credit score." Brandon let out a short laugh. "Kindness is free," he replied. "Insurance policies are not." The room went quiet again. Even the jazz music overhead suddenly felt distant. Claire's blue eyes lowered briefly toward the marble floor before she looked back up at him with calm dignity. "I understand," she said. "I will leave if you want me to." Brandon folded his arms. "I think that would be best." Then came the final humiliation. "There is a pre-owned lot down the road," he added casually. "You might find something more realistic there." The words echoed harder than he expected. Even Mrs. Davenport frowned slightly inside the car. Claire inhaled slowly and adjusted the strap on her tote bag. Her face remained composed, but something about the silence surrounding her changed the atmosphere in the showroom. The younger receptionist finally spoke up in a hesitant voice. "Sir, maybe we could at least let her sit inside the vehicle." Brandon shot her a sharp look. "This is a luxury dealership, Emily. We maintain standards here." "Standards?" The word hung in the air like cold steel. Claire nodded once, almost sadly, then turned toward the exit. Her white sneakers tapped softly against the marble floor as dozens of eyes followed her. Brandon felt strangely satisfied watching her walk away. To him, this was how business worked. Wealth recognized wealth. Status recognized status. And people who did not belong should be reminded of it quickly. But just as Claire reached the glass doors, a deep engine rumbled outside the showroom. Heads turned instinctively toward the entrance as a black Bentley Flying Spur slowly rolled to a stop beneath the front awning. The entire mood inside Bennett Luxury Motors shifted in an instant. The moment the black Bentley stopped outside the showroom, every salesperson instinctively straightened their posture. Brandon's smug confidence shifted instantly into polished professionalism as he adjusted his jacket and glanced toward the entrance with sudden urgency. Expensive cars visited Bennett Luxury Motors every day, but that particular Bentley carried weight inside the company. Even the security guard near the front desk subtly stepped aside as the driver's side door opened. A tall man in a charcoal gray suit stepped out calmly, sunlight flashing briefly against the silver watch beneath his cuff. Ethan Bennett moved with the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to prove he belonged anywhere. At 42, he had built Bennett Luxury Motors from a single struggling dealership into one of the most respected luxury auto groups in the Northeast. But unlike many wealthy men Brandon admired, Ethan carried no arrogance in the way he dressed or walked. Real power rarely needed attention. Inside the showroom, whispers spread quickly between employees. "That is him. Why is he here today?" Nobody said the owner was coming. Brandon immediately forced a welcoming smile onto his face and hurried toward the entrance, nearly abandoning the Davenports mid-conversation. "Mr. Bennett," he called out warmly. "What a surprise." But Ethan barely acknowledged him. His sharp blue eyes moved calmly across the showroom until they landed on Claire, standing quietly near the glass doors with her tote bag still over her shoulder. The tension in Ethan's expression changed instantly. Concern replaced distance. He walked directly past Brandon without slowing down. The marble floors echoed beneath his polished shoes as every employee watched in confusion. Claire looked up at him with soft surprise. "You are early," she said quietly. Ethan's eyes studied her face carefully. "I finished the meeting ahead of schedule," he replied. Then his voice lowered slightly. "Claire, why do you look upset?" A hush fell across the showroom. Brandon froze beside the Aston Martin display as realization slowly began creeping into his stomach like ice water. Claire hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There was just a misunderstanding," she answered gently. Ethan glanced around the room once. He noticed the silence, the uncomfortable expressions, the receptionist avoiding eye contact. Then he looked back toward Brandon, whose confidence was visibly fading second by second. "A misunderstanding," Ethan repeated calmly. "About what?" Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the soft jazz music overhead suddenly felt painfully loud. Claire could have exposed everything right there. She could have repeated every humiliating comment Brandon made. But that was never who she was. I asked about test driving the Aston Martin, she explained softly. Mr. Cole did not think it was appropriate. Ethan slowly turned his head toward Brandon. The salesman immediately forced a nervous laugh. Sir, I was simply following dealership protocol. Ethan said nothing at first. That silence was somehow worse. Brandon felt sweat gathering beneath his collar as several employees exchanged uneasy glances nearby. Protocol, Ethan finally repeated. Interesting. He walked slowly toward the silver Aston Martin while running his fingers lightly across the hood. Tell me, Brandon, Ethan said evenly, what exactly qualifies someone to sit inside one of my vehicles? Brandon swallowed hard. Well, serious buyers, sir. Ethan nodded once. And how did you determine my wife was not one? The room went completely silent. Mrs. Davenport's mouth parted slightly inside the Aston Martin. Emily at the reception desk visibly froze. One salesman nearly dropped the espresso cup in his hand. Brandon's face drained of color so quickly it looked unreal beneath the showroom lights. Wife. The word hit the room like thunder wrapped in velvet. Claire lowered her eyes quietly while Ethan looked directly at Brandon with calm disappointment instead of anger. Somehow, that made it far worse. Brandon opened his mouth once, then closed it again when no explanation came fast enough to save him. The confidence that had carried him through the entire afternoon was gone now, replaced by the unmistakable panic of a man realizing every word he had spoken was about to cost him everything. Ethan stood beside the Aston Martin with one hand resting lightly against the silver hood, while Claire remained near the showroom entrance, calm and composed despite the dozens of stunned eyes fixed on her. Nobody in the building seemed willing to breathe too loudly. Brandon forced an awkward smile that looked painful on his face. Sir, I did not realize Mrs. Bennet was. He stopped himself mid-sentence. Ethan's expression hardened slightly. Was what? Brandon hesitated. I did not know who she was. Ethan nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully. That seems to be the problem. The words landed softly, but every employee felt the weight behind them. Brandon quickly glanced around the showroom, as if hoping someone might step in and rescue him from the moment unfolding in front of everyone. Nobody moved. Mrs. Davenport quietly stepped out of the Aston Martin and folded her arms while watching the scene with growing discomfort. Emily at the reception desk looked completely mortified now. Her cheeks flushed red as she replayed every second of the humiliation Claire had endured. Ethan turned his attention back toward Claire. Did you ask politely for a test drive? Claire gave a small nod. Yes. Did you cause any disruption? No. Ethan's eyes shifted toward Brandon again. Then why exactly was my wife treated like she did not belong here? Brandon swallowed hard. Sir, I was only trying to protect the dealership from people who waste time. Ethan let the silence stretch for several long seconds before replying. Do you know how I bought my first car dealership? Brandon blinked in confusion. No, sir. I was 26 years old, Ethan said calmly. I walked into a bank wearing jeans covered in motor oil because I had spent all morning fixing engines myself. The loan officer looked at me exactly the way you looked at Claire today. The room remained completely still. Ethan's voice never rose, but every word cut deeper than anger could have. He assumed I was uneducated. He assumed I was poor. Most of all, he assumed appearances told him everything he needed to know. Brandon lowered his eyes. Ethan continued quietly. 3 years later, I bought the building that bank operated in. A faint hush rippled through the showroom. Claire watched her husband silently, her expression softening slightly. Ethan had never enjoyed humiliating people. That was what made moments like this so powerful. There was no cruelty in him, only disappointment. Luxury cars are not what built this company, Ethan said. Trust did, respect did, and people like Claire did. Brandon looked genuinely shaken now. Sir, I never meant to disrespect Mrs. Bennet. Ethan tilted his head slightly. That is interesting, because disrespect seemed very easy for you when you thought she was ordinary. The marble floors echoed softly as Ethan stepped closer to him. Not aggressively, just enough to force Brandon to face the truth directly. Tell me honestly, Ethan asked. If Claire walked in wearing designer heels and carrying a $5,000 handbag, would this conversation even exist right now? Brandon could not answer, because everyone in the showroom already knew the truth. Emily slowly lowered her eyes behind the reception desk. One salesman stared silently at the floor. Even the wealthy clients nearby looked uncomfortable now, as though they were witnessing something much bigger than a disagreement at a dealership. Claire finally stepped forward gently before the silence became unbearable. "Ethan," she said softly, "that is enough." But Ethan looked at Brandon one final time and said the words nobody in the showroom would ever forget. The true measure of class is how you treat someone when you believe they have nothing to offer you. And suddenly, the entire showroom understood exactly who the poorest person in the building really was. The silence inside Bennett Luxury Motors no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt revealing, like a mirror had suddenly been lifted in front of everyone in the showroom, forcing them to confront something ugly they had all quietly accepted for years. Brandon stood frozen beside the Aston Martin display, his carefully crafted confidence completely shattered beneath the bright showroom lights. Claire looked toward Ethan gently, almost wishing the moment would end before the humiliation became unbearable for everyone involved. But Ethan Bennett was not finished yet. Not because he wanted revenge, because some lessons needed witnesses. He slowly turned toward the employees gathered near the sales desks and reception counter. "How many of you," he asked calmly, "saw what was happening today?" Nobody answered. A few salesmen shifted awkwardly. Emily lowered her eyes immediately. Ethan nodded slightly, as though the silence itself answered the question for him. "And how many of you thought it was wrong?" This time, Emily quietly raised her hand halfway before nervously lowering it again. Ethan noticed. Claire noticed too. Brandon looked as though he wanted the marble floor to swallow him whole. Ethan's voice remained steady. "Do you know why Claire dresses this way?" he asked, glancing briefly toward his wife. Nobody spoke. "Because she spends most of her days sitting beside sick children in hospitals. Because she believes people deserve comfort more than appearances. Because she stopped caring about impressing strangers a long time ago." A hush settled over the room once again. Mrs. Davenport slowly crossed her arms tighter, visibly affected now by everything she was hearing. Ethan continued quietly. "My wife helped raise over $18 million for pediatric cancer programs in the last 4 years. Several employees visibly reacted to that number. She personally visits children during treatment every single week," Ethan added. "And today, after spending her morning at St. Gabriel Children's Hospital, she came here hoping to surprise her younger sister with the car she dreamed about during chemotherapy." Brandon closed his eyes briefly. Every word seemed to shrink him further in front of the entire showroom. Claire touched Ethan's arm gently. "You do not need to say all of that," she whispered softly. Ethan looked at her with warmth for a moment before answering quietly, "Yes, I do." Then he faced the staff again. "Because too many people confuse humility with weakness." The room went still again. Even the distant sounds of traffic outside the glass walls felt muted now. Brandon finally found enough courage to speak. "Mrs. Bennett, I truly am sorry." Claire looked at him carefully. For the first time all afternoon, there was no arrogance left in his face. Only shame. Genuine shame. "I believe you are," she replied softly. "But the problem is not just what happened to me." Brandon frowned slightly, confused. Claire glanced around the showroom. "What happens when someone walks in here who really does not have money?" she asked quietly. "Do they deserve humiliation too?" Nobody could answer her, because everyone understood the truth behind the question. Ethan slowly removed the keys to the Aston Martin from the salesperson desk nearby and placed them gently into Claire's hand. Gasps rippled through the room. "Would you still like that test drive?" he asked softly. Claire looked down at the silver keys resting in her palm for a moment before smiling faintly. "Only if Emily comes with me," she said. The young receptionist looked up in complete shock. "Me?" Claire nodded warmly. "You were the only person who tried to help." Emily's eyes instantly filled with tears she tried desperately to hide. Brandon looked away completely now, unable to even meet their eyes anymore. And as Claire and Emily slowly walked toward the Aston Martin together beneath the glowing showroom lights, something inside Bennett Luxury Motors quietly changed that afternoon. Not because the owner had walked in, but because dignity had. The silver Aston Martin glided out of the showroom beneath the soft glow of the evening sun, and for the first time all afternoon, a genuine sense of warmth returned to the building. Employees stood silently near the glass walls watching Claire ease the car onto the boulevard with Emily nervously seated beside her. The engine purred smoothly, elegant and controlled, but it was not the luxury vehicle that captured everyone's attention anymore. It was the quiet grace of the woman driving it. Inside the showroom, the atmosphere remained painfully tense. Brandon still stood near the display platform with his shoulders stiff and his face pale, while Ethan walked slowly toward the reception area. Nobody dared return to casual conversation. Nobody reached for their phones. The entire dealership seemed suspended inside the aftermath of something important. Ethan paused beside the espresso bar before turning calmly toward the sales team. "I want everyone in the conference room in 10 minutes, he said evenly, including management. No one argued. Brandon lowered his eyes immediately. 20 minutes later, the glass conference room overlooking the showroom felt colder than usual despite the warm lighting overhead. Brandon sat silently at the far end of the table while several employees avoided looking directly at him. Ethan remained standing near the windows with his hands loosely folded in front of him. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. Today was not about one bad interaction, he began calmly. It was about culture. The room stayed silent. Ethan continued. Somewhere along the way, this dealership started confusing luxury with superiority. He looked directly at the staff one by one. That ends now. Brandon swallowed hard. Ethan finally turned toward him. You are talented at selling cars, he said honestly. But leadership is not measured by sales numbers. It is measured by how safe people feel around you. Brandon's face tightened with shame. I understand, sir. Ethan nodded slowly. No, I do not think you did. Not until today. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crack glass. Then Ethan placed a thin folder onto the conference table. Human resources will process your suspension effective immediately while we conduct a full review. Brandon looked stunned, even though deep down he had known it was coming. Sir, please, he said quietly. I can fix this. Ethan's expression softened slightly, but not enough to change his decision. I hope you do fix it, he replied. But first you need to understand why this happened in the first place. Brandon lowered his head completely. Nobody in the room spoke another word. An hour later, the Aston Martin returned to the dealership just as dusk painted the sky in deep shades of gold and blue. Claire stepped out smiling softly while Emily followed beside her looking like an entirely different person than she had earlier that day. How was it? Ethan asked warmly. Claire held up the keys with a small grin. Smoothest ride I have ever had. Emily laughed nervously. I was terrified the whole time. The tension finally broke as several employees smiled for the first time all evening. Claire glanced around the showroom quietly before noticing Brandon exiting the conference room carrying a small box of personal belongings. Their eyes met briefly across the marble floor. Brandon stopped walking. Mrs. Bennet, he said softly. I truly am sorry. Claire studied him for a moment before answering gently. Then let this change you. Brandon nodded once. There was nothing else left to say. He walked slowly toward the exit while the showroom remained silent behind him. Ethan slipped an arm gently around Claire's shoulders as the doors closed. Outside, city lights flickered across the polished glass walls of Bennett Luxury Motors. And somewhere between the marble floors, the luxury cars, and the expensive suits, everyone in that building finally learned something money could never buy. Respect. The next morning, Bennett Luxury Motors opened under a completely different atmosphere. Employees who normally rushed through the glass doors with distracted expressions now greeted one another carefully, almost thoughtfully, as though everyone understood the building itself had changed overnight. The story had already spread through every department before sunrise. Receptionists whispered about it near the coffee machines. Mechanics discussed it quietly in the service base. Even clients arriving for appointments sensed something unusual in the air. Claire Bennett had become impossible to ignore. But what surprised people most was not that the owner's wife had been humiliated. It was how gracefully she had handled it. Emily arrived 30 minutes early that morning, nervous energy still lingering in her chest from the day before. As she settled behind the reception desk, she noticed a small white envelope waiting beside the computer monitor with her name written neatly across the front. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. Thank you for choosing kindness when it was difficult. Never lose that. Claire. Emily stared at the card silently while emotion tightened in her throat. Tucked beneath the note was a second paper. 2 VIP tickets to the Children's Charity Gala hosted by the Bennett Foundation the following weekend. Emily covered her mouth softly in disbelief. Meanwhile, upstairs in his office overlooking the showroom, Ethan stood near the massive windows watching employees arrive below. The city skyline reflected faintly across the glass behind him, while morning sunlight stretched across the polished floor. Claire stepped inside carrying 2 cups of coffee and smiled gently when she saw him lost in thought. "You are worried about something?" she said quietly. Ethan accepted the coffee with a faint smile. "I keep thinking about how easy it was for everyone to stay silent yesterday." Claire leaned lightly against the edge of his desk. "People follow culture," she replied softly. "And culture follows leadership." Ethan looked at her carefully. "Which means I should have seen this sooner." Claire reached for his hand. "Maybe," she admitted. "But you saw it when it mattered." Downstairs, several employees gathered nervously near the center showroom after receiving an unexpected company-wide meeting notice. Nobody knew exactly what Ethan planned to say next. Some feared more suspensions. Others worried the dealership's reputation had already been permanently damaged. At precisely 9 o'clock, Ethan walked calmly onto the showroom floor beside Claire. The room immediately fell silent. Ethan looked around slowly before speaking. "Yesterday exposed something ugly," he began evenly. "Not just in one person. In all of us." No one moved. "Luxury should never make people feel small," he continued. "If it does, then we are not selling excellence. We are selling insecurity." Several employees lowered their eyes quietly. Ethan glanced toward Claire for a moment before continuing. "Starting today, Bennett Luxury Motors will partner directly with the Bennett Foundation to create transportation programs for families with children undergoing long-term medical treatment." Murmurs spread softly through the crowd. "Every dealership location," Ethan added, "will also begin mandatory hospitality and ethics training focused on dignity, respect, and bias awareness." The employees looked stunned. Nobody expected compassion to follow a moment of humiliation. But that was the difference between power and character. Power punished. Character rebuilt. Claire stepped forward gently then, her soft voice carrying through the silent showroom. "Yesterday was painful," she admitted honestly. "But if something good comes from it, then maybe it mattered for a reason." Her eyes moved carefully across the employees standing before her. "Every person who walks through these doors deserves to feel seen, not measured." The room remained completely still. Then Emily quietly began clapping. One by one, others slowly joined her until the sound filled the showroom beneath the morning light. And for the first time in years, Bennett Luxury Motors no longer felt like a building designed only for wealthy people. It finally felt human. 3 weeks later, the annual Bennett Foundation Gala transformed the Grand Meridian Hotel into a sea of warm golden lights, polished crystal, and quiet elegance. Wealthy donors moved through the ballroom in tailored tuxedos and shimmering gowns, while soft piano music drifted beneath towering chandeliers. But unlike most charity galas filled with forced smiles and shallow conversations, this event carried something different in the air that night. Purpose. Along the ballroom walls stood photographs of children whose lives had been changed through the Foundation's medical support programs. Families laughed softly together near the silent auction tables. Doctors, nurses, volunteers, and business leaders mingled without hierarchy. And near the center of it all, Claire Bennett moved through the room in a simple navy dress, greeting every guest with the same warmth she had shown children in hospital rooms for years. She wore no flashy jewelry, no dramatic designer labels. Yet somehow, she carried more grace than anyone else in the building. Emily stood near the entrance, clutching her invitation with nervous hands, still unable to believe she had been invited into a world that once felt impossibly distant. When Claire spotted her across the ballroom, her face immediately brightened. "You came," Claire said warmly as she walked over. Emily laughed softly. "I almost did not. I spent an hour deciding if these shoes looked too cheap." Claire smiled knowingly. "Funny how easy it is to start measuring yourself after people spend long enough measuring you first." Emily lowered her eyes briefly before replying. "I think that day changed me." Claire's expression softened. "Good," she said quietly. "It changed us too." Across the ballroom, Ethan stood speaking with several donors when a familiar figure stepped cautiously through the entrance doors. Brandon Cole. The room did not erupt into whispers the way he feared it might, but several people quietly recognized him immediately. Brandon looked different now. The arrogance that once sharpened every movement was gone. He wore a simple charcoal suit instead of the expensive tailored styles he used to favor, and there was an unfamiliar humility in the way he carried himself. He paused uncertainly near the entrance until Ethan noticed him. The two men locked eyes across the ballroom for a long moment before Ethan calmly excused himself from the donors and walked over. Brandon swallowed hard. "I know I probably should not be here," he admitted quietly. Ethan studied him carefully. "Then why are you?" Brandon glanced around the ballroom toward the photographs of children and families lining the walls. "Because after that day," he said softly, "I started seeing people differently. And I realized I spent years becoming someone I do not even like." Ethan said nothing at first. Brandon continued carefully. "I started volunteering at a local shelter during my suspension. At first it was only because Human Resources recommended community service before my review meeting. But then," he paused briefly, "then I met people who had lost homes, jobs, families. Good people. People I would have ignored before." The ballroom noise seemed to fade around them. "And I realized how many times I looked at someone and decided their worth in 5 seconds." Ethan's expression remained calm, but less guarded now. Brandon looked down briefly before reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out an envelope. "This is a donation," he explained quietly. "Not from the company. From me." Ethan accepted the envelope slowly. Brandon shook his head before Ethan could speak. "I know it does not erase what happened." Ethan glanced toward Claire across the ballroom. She was kneeling beside a young girl in a wheelchair near the dessert table, laughing gently as the child showed her a drawing. "No," Ethan admitted softly. "It does not." Brandon nodded once, accepting the truth of it. Then Ethan looked back at him and added something Brandon never expected to hear. "But becoming better matters too." Brandon's eyes lowered quietly as emotion tightened his throat. Around them, the gala continued beneath the golden lights and soft music. But somewhere inside that crowded ballroom, a man who once judged people by their appearance finally understood something far more valuable than status: humility. 6 months later, the transformation inside Bennett Luxury Motors had become impossible to ignore. Customers no longer entered the showroom feeling judged by their clothes, their age, or the car they arrived in. Receptionists greeted every visitor with genuine warmth. Sales teams listened more than they talked. And hidden beside the espresso bar, framed in simple black wood, hung a small silver plaque most clients paused to read before leaving. "Every person deserves dignity before they deserve business." The employees knew exactly where that quote came from. Claire still visited the dealership often, though most days she arrived the same way she always had. Jeans, comfortable sneakers, a quiet smile. The difference now was not in how she dressed. It was in how the building responded when she walked through the doors. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Claire sat near the showroom windows reviewing paperwork for the foundation while customers wandered between rows of polished vehicles beneath the soft glow of overhead lights. Ethan was away in Chicago for a conference, leaving the dealership unusually calm. Emily approached carrying 2 coffees before settling into the chair beside Claire. "You know," Emily said softly, "people still talk about that day." Claire smiled faintly over the rim of her cup. "I hope eventually they stop." Emily shook her head gently. "I do not." Claire looked at her curiously. Emily glanced around the showroom before speaking again. "Because before that happened, I used to think confidence came from money, or clothes, or status." Her eyes softened slightly. "Now I think confidence comes from knowing your worth even when nobody else sees it." Claire remained quiet for a moment before reaching over and squeezing Emily's hand gently. Across the showroom floor, a young man entered hesitantly, wearing a worn work jacket and muddy construction boots. Water dripped from his sleeves onto the marble floor as he looked around uncertainly at the luxury vehicles surrounding him. 6 months earlier, people might have stared. Someone might have smirked. Brandon probably would have escorted him toward the used inventory lot before the man even opened his mouth. But none of that happened now. Instead, a salesman named Daniel walked directly toward him with a warm smile and offered him coffee before asking how he could help. Claire watched quietly from across the room as the young man explained he had spent years saving money to buy a reliable car after starting his own roofing business. Daniel listened carefully, treated him with respect, and showed him vehicles without a trace of judgment in his voice. The young man's nervous posture slowly disappeared minute by minute. Claire smiled softly to herself. That was the real victory. Not Brandon's humiliation, not Ethan's power, not even the luxury cars themselves. It was this moment right here. A stranger walking into a room once built on appearances and finally feeling welcome. Outside, rain tapped gently against the massive glass windows while warm light reflected across the polished showroom floor. Emily followed Claire's gaze toward the young customer and smiled knowingly. "You changed this place," she whispered. Claire shook her head almost immediately. "No," she replied softly. "People change themselves when they are finally shown a better way." At that exact moment, the young man looked toward Daniel and laughed with visible relief, no longer intimidated by the showroom around him. And somewhere between the falling rain, the marble floors, and the quiet hum of luxury engines, Bennett Luxury Motors finally became something far more valuable than successful. It became kind, because in the end, the world rarely remembers who had the most money in the room, but it always remembers who made others feel small and who chose not to.